Thanks, Julie, and hello, everyone. Hope you're all well. In today's seminar, I'm going to be presenting the first ever typology of recreational sea anglers in England and Wales, based on research I completed last year, which was funded by the ESRC, the CCRI, and CFAS. So I'm currently a research fellow, postdoctoral research fellow at the CCRI at the University of Gloucestershire, continuing my research on recreational angling. But the data and the findings I'm going to present to you today is from research that I did between 2020 and 2023, when I was a PhD student at the CCRI, supervised by Julie Urquhart and Kieran Hyder at Julie's at the CCRI and Kieran's at CFAS. The research project took place, and I'll give a bit more detail into the context as to why the typology was needed. But in this era of sort of 2020 to 2023, it was obviously post-Brexit, at a time when sort of new fishing policy was being introduced in the UK, but it also coincided with this growing momentum in the academic literature of a focus on heterogeneity among anglers and the importance of that. So the UK at that time provided a real useful petri dish, if you like, to develop and test theory around angler heterogeneity at a time of policy change. So there are two aims of the seminar. Firstly, to prevent the typology, present the typology and its theoretical and implied implications. And secondly, I kind of want to go like a step beyond and really hopefully stimulate discussion on its practical application. And hopefully we've attracted some fishery management practitioners or those involved in fisheries policy here today to enable that discussion. And there'll be time for this after the presentation. And before we go any further, I guess I should just sort of define and confirm what I mean by typology. What I really mean is essentially just a simplified structure of types that best describes similarities and differences in a given population. And I guess the key thing for typologies is this balance between simplicity and ease of understanding, but enough complexity to make sure that you're capturing all the relevant diversity within your given population or your population of study.
Sorry to interrupt, Adam. Are you moving your slides? Because we're still on the front slide.
Yeah. No, yeah, still on the first slide. Don't worry.
Go.
I'm not the sort of person that will bore you to death with slides. So I try to keep my slides as minimal as possible. And, you know, the gold is in what I say. Hopefully, anyway. Yeah, so don't worry. We're on the correct slide. Talking of which. So without going into too much detail, it is important to give some background onto why the typology was needed. And I'm sure that most of you will be aware, or some of you actually, maybe not all, that Brexit and the implementation of the Fisheries Act, the Joint Fisheries Statement and suite of Fishery Management Plans drew more attention to this idea of more integration of recreational fishing into the policy framework. And you can see on screen here a quote from the Joint Fisheries Statement that really hits that home. And like I said before, in the research world, in the academic world, there was a growing body of literature demonstrating the importance of understanding components of angler makeup and differences among anglers to help inform and understand responses to fishery management. And here in the second bullet point is just some examples of that literature. And it's important just to highlight that this literature comes from studies that were conducted outside of the UK. So in Europe, Germany, for example, Australia, and also in the US. So these two things together, this policy change, policy focus, and this growing body of academic research, putting these two things together really gave the impetus to really understand more about the social characteristics of the UK recreational sea angling community. Now, at that time, back in 2020, in the UK, the monitoring of the recreational sector captured catch data, some data on economic activity, and some social data as well, but very limited. And this was collected via off-site sampling, and then techniques were applied to the data to raise it to population level. And it was recognised that in that process there were likely biases, particularly in the sampling technique, and that there were probably more stronger ways to assess and compare sample characteristics to support that extrapolation of catch data. And this involved the use of, or sort of the discussion was around the use of socio-psychometric angler profiles. And at that point, there was no such data and no such model description of how the angling community looked in regards to such characteristics to inform that sampling comparison and that sampling bias assessment. So as you can see, there were really kind of two things driving this work. There was the change in policy and the focus on recreational fishing. And then there was this really nitty-gritty detailed driver around how we assess and monitor the sector, how we measure its impact in terms of catch and fish stock, and how we can better assess bias in sampling techniques, which is what the monitoring was based on. So it was kind of a here I come to save the day type project, and I'll leave it up to your judgment as to whether I did actually save the day and give what was needed to help this work progress in the future. So in terms of approach and method, the key question to meet these aims really was, what data should be captured and upon what lines should angular differences be measured. And I don't know why, but it often sort of images spring to mind of a cake. And if you think of the cake as the angling population, there's obviously different ways you can cut that cake, and there's different ways you can put the knife in. I'm just thinking of when I'm trying to cut a birthday cake and then my mum comes in and said, "Oh, you don't cut it like that, you start from..." Anyway, so there's these different ways of cutting the cake. The key question was, well, how do we do that? And it was really tricky to answer that question, because the policy driver, as I've just discussed, was generic, and there was no standard approach for assessing sample bias using non-traditional data. I broadly knew that there was a hell of a lot of literature on angling, research literature, and I knew that generally angling was as much about things, it was as much about not catching fish as what it was about catching fish. So there were these other things that were motivating anglers to take part in fishing. It wasn't just about catching fish, it was about being in nature and that kind of thing. So the logical approach was to employ a new wide-ranging data collection framework, inclusive of data related to previous theory on angler heterogeneity, in addition to other data reflecting characteristics known to influence angler behaviour. And this sort of formed the conceptual framework that I used for the study, which you can see here in this lovely diagram. I'm just going to give you a few seconds to have a look at that, because I'm not going to go through it in detail. So briefly, I understood the research landscape to involve two approaches to angler heterogeneity. There were the hierarchical measures, which are shown on the left of the diagram, and these involved typologies and methods of forming typologies, which involved placing anglers on a low to high continuum. And in this context, specialization was the main form of differentiating anglers over the past sort of 2 decades or so. And as you can see, specialization as a concept was formed from three different subdomains, and then each subdomain has further subdomains. And then on the opposite side of the diagram, there were what I call lateral approaches. And these aren't graded measures, based on like positioning an angler on a continuum from low to high. But these were based on describing anglers on performance in different metrics and different characteristics that are sometimes completely different from one another and have no conceptual link. And also in my reading, there were, like I said before, the other measures that weren't necessarily used in typologies or studies of heterogeneity, but had been used as predictors or antecedents of behaviour or preference for different policy scenarios. And that included things such as the environmental views there on the right-hand side of the diagram. But it's also important to note that specialisation was also used in that context as well. So the idea was to collect data according to this framework, run the analysis, see where the divisions were, and draw together a model that described heterogeneity in its simplest but comprehensive form. So in setting up the project and implementing the project, I administered an e-survey among quite a large sample frame. The survey was distributed through a database of anglers held by CFAS, which was used in their monitoring work, sector monitoring work. It was distributed through Sea Angler magazine, the Angling Trust, and also through Facebook. So I asked local fishing groups who had Facebook representation to distribute the link for me. And it really represented a convenient sampling approach. The survey questionnaire mainly included statement-based questions drawn from the literature that reflected that diagram, the conceptual framework diagram. And they were the questions were mainly based on sort of statements, and then, to what extent do you agree with these statements, so on, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So in terms of responses, I had 567 responses, and that whittled down to 453 after cleaning and outlier analysis. Although it was convenience, sort of non-probabilistic type sampling, it's important to mention that I did actually go above that threshold for representativeness, which was calculated at 384. How did the sample look? Compared to known characteristics of the UK angling population, my sample were slightly older, spent more time fishing, but spent less time on equipment, but reflecting known characteristics of the UK angling community. They were male, white British, mainly lived in the southeast and southwest of England. So after the survey, I did a number of qualitative interviews with those who took part in the survey phase. And those interviews explored some of the things that, so the survey is very top level, and it didn't give me some of the information I needed to really understand some of the findings of the survey. And this will become a bit more clear as I talk about the results a bit later. But basically, I explored the survey findings in the interviews. and the nature of the interviews were semi-structured, so there was lots of opportunity for anglers to say what they felt. Also in the interviews, I conducted a typology validation exercise, which is quite unique in the literature. It had never been done before. And again, I'll give some more detail on this when I talk about the results of that a bit further on in the presentation. Just a brief overview of the analysis. So I condensed and reduced the data and identified components in the data based on factor analysis using principal component analysis to extract the factors. And then I used these factors in a cluster analysis to identify my angling segments. And the best way to view these two types of analysis, I guess, is the first kind of groups your data and your variables, and then the second groups your cases or your people or your anglers in your sample. And then I used thematic content analysis to explore the findings of the survey from the interviews. Okay, so the first part of the analysis looked at which statement responses covaried across the sample. And based on that analysis, the best solution to describe the data involved 10 factors, which are listed here. And I'll just give you a few seconds to read the factors. But what you can see is that for each of the factors in brackets, we have the number of statements that loaded onto that particular component. And then I've not included all the statements that are loaded onto each one because it would have looked really messy. So instead, what I've done is I've included the statement with the highest loading factor onto that particular component, just to give you a flavour of each one. Most of the components here, the 10 components listed, were easy to describe based on the nature of the statements that align to each one. But the third one down, the identity component, was really difficult to define because it wasn't clear based on the statements what part of fishing related to identity, or vice versa, what part of identity related to fishing. There was an unknown there. So this was explored during the interviews. Lots of other stuff was explored during the interviews, but it's probably too time consuming to talk about that here. So I'd just like to talk about this stuff around identity. So 15 anglers highlighted the importance of angling to their identity. 10 specifically reported that angling allowed them to engage in their enthusiasm for the outdoors and nature, helping to construct and reflect their identity. And this was nicely captured by one particular interviewee who said, fishing is about putting yourself against the challenges of not just fish, but the environment. I'm into the environment anyway, being out there in the environment, lots of watery stuff, surfing and kayaking. So as I said before, the factor scores or the component scores were used in this process of hierarchical cluster analysis, in which several different scenarios were tested to see which scenario performed the best. And what I mean by scenarios is different numbers of clusters were tested to see which one described the data in its most simplest but comprehensive way. And the strongest solution, I'm not going to present all the different scenarios that I tested, but the strongest solution in this case involved 4 clusters and you can see the 4 clusters' performance across each of the factors or components in this figure here. Just take a few seconds to have a look at that. And then to further test the strength of the 4 cluster model, I ran an analysis of variance to see whether the differences between clusters were apparent in other data not used in the factoring process. And in that respect, I focused on stewardship behaviours and stewardship norms. And this really was about assessing the predictive validity of the clusters and the factors. Again, I'll just give you a few seconds to look at this table. As you can see, there were differences between segments in 2 of the 3 behaviours tested, and all of the norms tested. More specifically, I observed differences between, so the ANOVA on the first 2 columns of data give you the overall variance, and then the post hoc testing, which are the 4 columns on the right, gives you a bit more data about where the differences are. And you can see that between segments, well, there are main differences between segments 1 and 4 in relation to behaviours, and those segments also differed in relation to a norm around feelings of guilt. There was also a difference between segments 1 and 2 in relation to, again, in relation to the norm around guilt, and also the first norm in that table. And I think overall, if we were going to maybe just do a sort of top level visual analysis, you can see that segment 1 is probably the most different compared to any other segment. There was also a significant relationship between cluster membership and motivation, validating the hypothesis that changes in angular type was reflected by changes in reasons for taking part in recreational fishing. And the reason why it's not captured in this table, motivation, is because in hindsight, I would have collected the motivation data differently, but the motivation data was captured as nominal categories. So there was motivations surrounding things related to catching fish, and then anglers were asked to select if they were motivated by things not related to catching fish. And then the third option was if anglers were motivated by a kind of equal amount of both, so both catch related and non-catch related factors. So this test I did basically show that there is some significant relationship between cluster and motivation. Then using the the factor scores and the predictive validity variables, the cluster segments were named and described. So on this slide here, you can see, I'll read these out so you don't need to read them, but just to let you know, in the central box there, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So that correlates to the segments in the previous slides in the analysis, although it's not the order of most frequent in the sample. So the largest group in the sample, as described by those variables, were what I call the social anglers, 35% of the sample, and they scored highly regarding the opportunity provided by angling to be with friends, They placed lower importance on consuming fish, although some emphasis on catch-related aspects of angling. They were the most likely cluster in the typology to be motivated by non-catch aspects, though they showed less a propensity to associate angling with their identity and did not see it as central to their life. They were more likely to engage in stewardship behaviours in comparison to the consumer segment. So the social anglers were the 4, and the consumer segment was the 1 in the previous slides. The second largest group were the consumers in the top left of the slide. They placed, as you'd expect, importance on retaining and eating fish, motivated by experiences related to catching fish, and associated angling with an opportunity to be with friends. They did not view angling as a centrally important part of their life and were less likely to feel responsibility to protect the environment compared to other segments. They held lower levels of stewardship norms, particularly to trophy anglers, and were less likely to carry out stewardship behaviours in comparison to social anglers. So the second largest group was the leisure identity group, leisure identity anglers. They placed lower importance on catching fish and their characteristics. They linked recreational sea angling to their personal identity, reflecting how they see themselves and how they want to be viewed by others in a leisure context. Specifically, angling facilitates their engagement in the natural environment and fulfills their general desire to be outdoors. And angling plays a central role in their life. And then last but not least, we have the trophy anglers who scored highly on characteristics of the catch, size and challenge of catching fish, and expressed biocentric viewpoints. They were less likely to engage in angling for social reasons and felt guilt towards not protecting the environment, also demonstrating a sense of moral obligation to conservation. So in terms of, bear with me. There we go. Sorry, it wouldn't click to the next slide. In terms of the validation exercise, during the interviews, anglers were read these definitions, but obviously I didn't tell them which group they belonged to as a result of the survey analysis. And they were firstly asked to place themselves in one group that they felt best reflected them as an angler, and this was like a forced choice. They had to put themselves in one group. And secondly, they were asked to rank how well they fitted or how well they thought they aligned to each group. And that was on a scale from complete alignment, strong but not complete, mildly, and then not at all. And I didn't do any complicated sort of statistics or analysis on this. So it's basically just a sort of descriptive overview. So 16 of the 24 anglers taking part in the validation exercise positioned themselves in the segmentation to which they were assigned in the survey analysis. And the number increased to 20 anglers when, based on the second scenario, the ranking exercise. So 20 anglers when you combine those that felt they completely or strongly, but not completely, aligned with their assigned segmentation. In terms of drilling down into the segments, the leisure identity and consumer segments showed the strongest verification, 6 out of 7 in relation to the former and 4 out of 5 in relation to consumers. So I think that's actually quite strong. I know it's not statistically strong, but I think that's quite good results. And this approach was very unique in the literature. So I guess statistically speaking, the step following a factor and cluster analysis would be discriminant analysis to test how strong your types were. You split the sample and perform the discriminant analysis. But I thought, well, that's, angling literature is pickled with stats and numbers and so on. And I thought, as I'm speaking to these anglers anyway, to explore some of the concepts, why don't I just ask them directly in a kind of qualitative way to verify the strength of the typology? So it was very unique in that respect. But it's important just to highlight what this sort of validation exercise actually verified, because I think it's easy to think, it's easy to sort of misunderstand this, to verify the fact that these angling groups exist outside of this study. That's not what the validation exercise actually did, although I will talk about this in a few more slides because I have something to say on that. That's not what the validation did in this respect. It's not saying, these groups are definitely going to exist in a sample outside of this one. What the verification did was to verify the strength of the approach, as in combining dispersed responses across variables into one homogeneous description that anglers felt accurately reflected their angling experiences. So it really is like a qualitative version of a kind of discriminant analysis, although I'm sure those of you who are statistically minded might argue against that. But there we go. Okay, so, sorry, my mouse is, there we go. So in terms of the theoretical observations, I don't want to spend too long on the sort of theoretical context or implications of my work, but it is important to highlight a few things. So firstly, the angler types that I developed are not new. So, in the previous slide, I was saying about this, the validation exercise wasn't about verifying the existence of these angler types outside of the study sample. In kind of opposition to that, I think I can say that I think we're at a point in research where we can say the angler types that I've developed probably do exist in most angling communities. I don't think we're going to be finding any new groups, and I don't think there's going to be any new types of data collection that's going to throw up surprise groupings based on surprise characteristics. The groups I developed are apparent in other literature, such as that presented here, Beardmore, Johnson, McGee. And what's interesting is that the other studies are based on mixed environments, just freshwater environments, and in other countries. So I think we're at a point in the research journey where we can say that, these groups, we can be pretty sure that these groups will exist in most angling communities. Secondly, if you cast, you won't be able to remember this probably, but in the model, the conceptual framework that I showed you earlier on in the presentation, and we had the specialization bubble, and then we had 3 components. Well, basically, the 2 of those components were omitted in the factor analysis as a result of multi-collinearity violations. And the behavioural commitment variables and the cognition variables represented 2 of the 3 components of specialisation theory, suggesting that it's probably not the best measure to describe variation among sea anglers, recreational sea anglers in England and Wales, based on this analysis and this approach. And this is quite an important observation because specialisation had been the most popular method for understanding angler heterogeneity in the literature over the past few decades. And this study is really questioning its conceptual basis because they don't seem to sit together in a covariance. More positively, components of angler involvement showed strong performance in the factor analysis. So we're talking about social bonding, identity, actually centrality, which is also part of specialisation. And while I've used these components in a lateral sense, I think there's definitely potentially a piece of work around using those components in a hierarchical analysis. So perhaps coming up with a continuum from low to high of angler involvement. So a piece of work to do in the future, perhaps. Environmental values as a kind of new concept in heterogeneity was very useful in understanding divisions in the sample. And there were several other methodological findings which go down to the nitty-gritty of how you measure each concept in the model and the statements you use and so on. But I'm not going to go into that detail here. I'd be happy to discuss that in the future, and my email address will be at the end of the presentation. Okay, so what does all this mean? And this is something I want to open up for discussion in a few minutes. But before that, here are my evidence-based thoughts. So firstly, the typology presented here provides the blueprint to feed into future UK monitoring assessments and help to account for sample bias more accurately by helping to ensure that the samples are representative according to the most appropriate social data. And as we can see by these findings, that suggests that the data, the most important data to look at is values and attitudes, less so behaviours. But before that takes place and before you're able to use this work in future studies, future monitoring studies, the study really needs expanding based on probabilistic sampling to really understand the frequency of the angler types in the UK population, because this is what's needed to benchmark future monitoring studies against in order to assess sample composition. And it would be really good as part of that probabilistic sampling exercise to include some data collection on catch behaviours. And this would then raise the question of how to replicate the approach in the approach that I've used in my study, because data collection and questionnaires, are really, you need to be really efficient with your time to ensure a good response rate and avoid people dropping out. So you need to be really concise. And to put it bluntly, to do what I did would be just too long because there's too many variables, too many questions to present to potential respondents. And because I like to do things as simply as possible, I thought, well, we know that the angler types exist. So why don't we just ask anglers a question which cuts to the chase, and they can self-select and self-position themselves. So I've drafted a question here which could be used, which is pretty straightforward when taking part in recreational sea angling. What is most important to you from the options below? And then each of the options reflect the angler segments developed in this research. And this could be used in both the single fit scenario, where you can make a forced fit, or you could use it in a ranked scenario, or you could use both, because it wouldn't take too much time to do that. Secondly, I think the research has more uses than just in monitoring assessments and sample bias assessments. In wider environmental policy, typologies have been used to inform policy design and implementation. For example, aiming at helping to frame policy messages. And we can see the potential use of the typology in this context here. For example, and this is just, sort of scenario and potential scenario based. We know that enhancing regulatory protection measures for sea bass to communities of trophy anglers would benefit from message framing around environmental protection and conservation. But for consumers, that framing may have less impact. And we know that because we can look at the characteristics of those segments and make those judgments. And just thinking further down the line, if you're developing more effective message framing and policy framing, there is a chance that that's going to improve likelihood of compliance to that particular policy or regulation, or may have the opposite effect of maybe leading to non-compliance. And I think also this approach could be useful in the policy development stages. So we can use the typology to match policy stakeholders with planned engagement activity to ensure that the right beneficial or the right stakeholders, the right anglers, are being engaged in relation to the right policies and the right management approaches. We can see that for the FMPs that have been implemented recently, there have been a series of engagement events and engagement activities. And again, just thinking off the top of my head now, if you have a particular FMP or any strategy which you can see perhaps has more relevance to certain types of angler in the typology, for example, consumers, or if it was, let's say, sea bass, and you see, well, this policy, this management approach is clearly more relevant to trophy anglers than consumers. You want to ensure that your engagement activities helping to form and implement that policy engages with trophy anglers. And again, you can use this question here that I've suggested as a way to perhaps monitor who you're engaging with, as a way to inform that process. And in fact, you could conduct a complete policy mapping exercise to look at the characteristics of the angler types, to look at your intended policy outcomes, and maybe even predict likely responses to the different policies based on what we know about the different characteristics of the different types of angler. So I think this is kind of like really the tip of the iceberg as to what can be done with the data and the findings that I've developed here. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and in the time we have left, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions about the research. And also, what I'd be really keen to hear from you all about is these two questions, or these two guided points for discussion. And that's, first of all, about the limitation and opportunities in the research approach and findings that I've presented to you. But calling to all you practitioners or fishery managers or those involved in policy, how do you envisage this research being of potential use to you and your work on a day-to-day basis? I'd be more than happy to hear from you in that respect. So yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. That's great. I'll open the questions up now to anybody out there. I see there's a couple of things in the chat. Roland, do you want to elaborate on your statement about the North Wales recreational sea anglers?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Adam. That was quite interesting. The second question that you've asked there is the question that we were asking back in 2006. We were trying to identify how much fish were actually being caught by recreational anglers, and we actually ended up with 7 categories, not 4 like you've got. The reason being is we were trying to answer the question of the amount of fish caught, and we identified that you could look at 7 categories to actually try and identify the amount of fish. We had online questionnaires, we had paper questionnaires, and we also went out to particular areas, where we knew there was angling taking place, once in the summer, once in the winter, because we identified there was different fish, different lengths of time between winter and summer, and different types of anglers. And also, one group of anglers that you never get when you do a questionnaire is match anglers. They don't seem to come in. So we went out on the beaches in matches and give every one of them a questionnaire. They were filling them in of how many fish they catch, because they have to do that for their competitions. And we were validating some of their catch by sitting behind them for half an hour and seeing how many fish they caught in that half an hour. And when we asked them all to put themselves into one of these 7 groups, we got at least 75% validation of all the groups, if not more, that they were splitting themselves into 7 groups, not into 4. They were giving us reasons, because we did have less groups to start with, and they were giving us reasons why they didn't fit in the less groups, why we had to split it up. So I don't know if you've seen them reports. There was 3 of them published, one for the winter, one for the summer, and one was a discussion of that research, what went right, what went wrong, what could be done better in the future, and everything. It's a very, very difficult thing, but it's like anything else, is what's your answer, what you're trying to do this, what you're trying to get out of it. Ours, we were trying to find out how many fish were caught and how often the anglers go fishing, which was very important for managers, because it's completely unknown what tonnage of all the different species of fish is caught by recreational anglers, and how that fits in with attack. So that's what we were trying to answer back then.
I mean, I haven't seen that work, but if it's publicly available, and you're more than happy to share it with me.
They're all published. The 3. I'll send you the copies afterwards, but they're all published reports.
I mean, there is the annual catch reports that CFAS produce, which would answer some of your questions. Kieran, are you here today? It's like I'm holding a seance. Kieran, are you in the room?
I am here, yes.
It just feel a bit seancey, that, didn't it? So Kieran, that's something that you head up, isn't it, in terms of impact on fish stock and catch of the recreational sector?
Yes, I mean, we've been using, Roland, you're probably completely aware of what we do and what we have been doing around the Sea Angling Diary. We've been generating estimates of catches. We haven't used typology quite so much in those as yet. We've used other characteristics of the diarists related to their catches, and use a modelling approach to raise our catches. So some demographic and some kind of catch related side of things, rather than trying to go down this typology route. But I think, as Adam has highlighted, the typology is quite important in terms of how you communicate, and more broadly about how you interact with people. It's a good point about match anglers. I need to think more about them. You're quite right. We may not have them in our diary. We probably have some, but they're probably a relatively small proportion of the population, I would have thought. I don't know what you found in your survey.
One thing we found quite unique was the match anglers are usually quite good. There was international level, them that fish for their country from the shore and everything. They're quite top of their game, and we found out that they were catching less fish than the anglers that may only go down once or twice a year, who may only have fished for a year. So that was quite an interesting thing that come out of it. When we're looking at numbers, it wasn't the most experienced anglers that caught the most fish. It was quite often the opposite way around. The least experienced anglers caught more fish than the experienced anglers. So
was that across all your effort for those groups in total, was it?
Yes, it was, because what was happening, we found that the top match anglers, they didn't go fishing for stuff like whiting and for pleasure fishing or mackerel or anything, which and a lot of the competitions were held at the times on the beaches where not that many fish would have been available on that beach, so that they can identify a winner rather than having too larger bags. So the ones that were fishing competitions regularly actually caught a lot less fish than them that were just going down on a Saturday night and throwing a bait off a pier or into the water. The other thing we did, we were looking at the survivability of fish, where, on the questionnaires, we were asking, did that fish you put back survive? A lot of them were saying yes, but we were sitting behind them and we actually seen them floating away. And there were certain species and the anglers on certain beaches that were getting a lot more mortality than what others were. So it was quite interesting identifying all that. And if it's like what I said, depends what you want the information for.
Yeah.
That's great, thank you. I'm just going to interrupt a bit. We've got a question in the room here, or a comment in the room. Damien, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. No, sorry to interrupt that interesting discussion. Thanks for your paper, Adam. It's really interesting. I mean, I come from the world of agriculture, and I just want to sort of throw in there that there has been a strong tradition within agriculture and agricultural, maybe agri-environmental policy around building typologies and segmenting. But just to flag also that there is some more critical literature, which is kind of suggesting perhaps to be sometimes wary of developing typologies, or at least to think about different ways that you might sort of conceptualize attitudes. And there was a really good paper, which is about 20 years old now, which was in a journal called Environment Planning A by Rob Fish. And what they were showing in relation to agri-environmental policy was not that you had necessarily types, but more what they called styles of participation. And so what they were getting at was that there can be leakage between categories, and actually you should also kind of not be scared to recognize that you can have those connections, you can have quite strong commonalities as well as sometimes differences. Do you know what I mean? So there might be some value and some interest in just having a look at not all of that literature, but some of the more interesting literature on kind of typologies in kind of farm and what you might call agri-environmental behavior type work, because I think you might find it quite interesting actually around this idea of how do we sort of think about heterogeneity, do you know? I can send you 1 or 2 papers if you're interested.
Yeah, that would be great, because I think with this type of work, sometimes because it's very like statistical, it's removed from those kind of real world issues. So all of a sudden you're thinking of heterogeneity in terms of in group similarities, between group numbers, and you're forgetting, you see it very black and white like that, and in actual fact maybe in reality there is leakage.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily about putting a person in a group, it's sometimes it's their, to a lesser degree, sometimes it's their behavior. So therefore, should you be basing types on behaviors and attitudes rather than the person themselves? But I think the typology, another criticism, I don't want to criticize my own work, but another problem with typologies is that they're only as strong or as useful as the way you've designed them, the way you've designed the data collection. And very few studies leave the safety of you know, like with my study, for example, I've gone to the literature and I've used metrics and different variables and different statements that have been proven in the past. And to my knowledge, there aren't any studies that leave that safety zone and go out and say, right, well, a completely grounded theory approach to putting a typology together. You know, let's disregard everything in the past and maybe use a novel sort of qualitative method. So what I'm trying to say is, in some respects, you feel like you're chasing you're chasing your own tail, but you've made this environment in which you're going to study types based on previous types in the literature. And in some respects, your results are going to be very similar. And I suppose one of the things that research needs to do is completely leave those safety zones.
There's a question from Daniel. Daniel, you've asked if you want, can you make a comment?
Yeah, hi. Just a couple of points really that I'm not quite sure what the difference in the data collection, that it was mainly from sort of southeast, southwest. I'm not sure if you got many responses from sort of north of the Humber.
Yeah, we did get a good proportion.
Yeah. And then really jumping onto the back of Roland's comments regarding the sort of matches that were surveyed in Wales. It seems to be a lot different once you get north of the Humber, that the match angling scene isn't catch and release. Everything is taken. And generally, the more experienced you are, the more you're going to catch. I mean, one match example that I fished this year, there was 250 kilos of cod taken by 50 anglers in one 6-hour fishing match. So I think the typologies that sort of people fit into aren't just individuals that are going to be put into these, but it's probably going to be regional as well, into where these people are fitting, rather than just on an individual basis. I mean, myself, looking at the descriptions that were placed on these typologies, looking at where I'm from, you would get a very different percentage responses, from social being the largest. You would probably see trophy being the largest into consumer.
Yeah. I do have that data to hand. Unfortunately, I can't pull it up now, but I'd be more than happy to communicate that to you. Sorry, did you say it's Daniel?
That'd be brilliant. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I'll send you. So your email is on the
yeah, it should be, yes.
I
can put it in the chat if not.
Yeah, okay. And I can email you that, because that's just sitting in a figure somewhere in my report. So
yeah, thank you.
That's fine. But I think coming back to the match angling thing has been raised a couple of times, and I think that's a really important consideration, because you're saying match angler and I'm thinking trophy angler. Do you see where I'm coming from? There is a debate around typologies and to what extent are they based on the interpretation of the person doing the analysis. Because essentially, when you're talking about a match angler, they're going to place characteristics. They're going to place emphasis on size of fish and characteristics of fish because of the competition. So therefore, in actual fact, they'd probably be, if you take that context of being in a fishing match away, they are actually trophy anglers. Do you agree? Or
we come up with that, not trophy angler but specimen angler was one of our categories, because what we found is there was a number of anglers that they don't fish matches, they fish on their own, they go out looking for bass, and they just after a decent bass, or their baits are big, or their hooks are bait, or they may go to a particular spot to get a large bull huss or a large conger, or they target particular big species, and they don't care if they don't catch anything else but that. You know, so that's slightly different to the match. You know, I understand what Daniel said because I've fished matches up in the northeast there. You know, and some of the matches down that was the North Wales what we were looking at. One angler might catch 100 fish, but out of them there might have been 90 undersized fish they couldn't land. So they're only landing. So the weigh-in has only got small numbers. They knew there's going to be larger numbers of smaller fish, but there wouldn't be many in-size fish that will go into the scale. So there'd be less. The weigh-in will be shorter. But you know, out of all that, there's a lot of dead fish going back in the water. So.
Yeah, I think those categories seem more suitable, Roland, than specimen rather than trophy.
Yeah,
that would be the way I would interpret it.
Yeah, that's what we ended up with. We did think about the trophy and everything, but no, because of what happened at Sea Angler, where they used to have the trophy badges years ago. But when we're speaking with the anglers and going out talking with them, betting the groups, it come up with specimen, not trophy.
Right. Sorry, everybody. I'm going to have to interrupt this interesting conversation, but we're over our hour now, so I think people have got other meetings they need to get to. But do, of course, please contact Adam independently, because it sounds like you've got a lot to discuss there. And if you don't have his email, then you can get in touch with us through the CCRI email. Anyway, just remains to say thanks so much, Adam, for your interesting talk, and I give you a round of applause for that.
Thank you.
And as we said, the video should be up on our YouTube site quite soon. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks. Well done, Adam.
Thanks, everyone.
Very good.
Thank you.
Bye.